Hello and welcome to Can You Dig It? I am the Beatlemeister and this is my very own Beatleverse. In this episode, I'm going to rank all 13 Beatles albums, including Yellow Submarine. Ranking the Beatles albums makes for a good introduction to the channel and to myself as the Beatlemeister. So let's get into it.
In the town where I was born.
Number 13 is Yellow Submarine. Released in January of 1969, sandwiched in between the White Album and Abbey Road. Beatles fans will not be surprised by this ranking because Yellow Submarine isn't really a Beatles album. It's a film soundtrack, with side 1 populated by Beatles songs and side 2 with instrumentals composed by Beatles producer George Martin. On side 1, we have 6 songs. The side starts off with the title track, Yellow Submarine, which was first released on Revolver, and ends with All You Need Is Love, which was first released as a single and then as the closing track on Magical Mystery Tour. In between, we have 4 previously unreleased tracks, one of which, Hey Bulldog, wasn't even included in the movie. We get 2 George Harrison songs, the psychedelic and chaotic It's Only a Northern Song, and the trippy acid rock masterpiece, It's All Too Much. We also get a great children's campfire sing-along with All Together Now, and one of the best all-time Beatles rockers, Hey Bulldog. All 4 new tracks are great, but an album they do not make. However, hearing the 4 new songs for the first time was like finding lost Beatles treasure, Beatles gems hidden in plain sight. And on side 2, March of the Meanies stands out for me. In fact, I would even argue that March of the Meanies was the inspiration for John Williams' The Imperial March from Star Wars. Listen to the 2 tracks back to back and see if they have any similarities. Comment down below if you suspect that John Williams might have drawn inspiration or downright stolen from George Martin on this one. Number 12, With the Beatles. Released in November of 1963, the Beatles' second album unleashed the madness of Beatlemania onto an unsuspecting world. With 8 original songs and 6 covers, this album, with its iconic cover art, along with the singles She Loves You and I Wanna Hold Your Hand, dominated the charts in the UK and the US for months. Standout songs on the album include It Won't Be Long, one of the Beatles' trademark Yeah 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 songs, All I've Got to Do, All My Loving, and I Wanna Be Your Man, the song that launched the Rolling Stones' career. Don't Bother Me, George Harrison's first ever composition, may not be the best song on the album, but it's the coolest song on the album and my personal favorite. Number 11, Please Please Me. The Beatles' debut album was released in March of 1963, 14 tracks with 8 originals and 6 covers. This album has one of the greatest opening tracks on a debut album in rock history, with I Saw Her Standing There. And it has probably the most iconic cover song of all time, Twist and Shout, as the album closer. In between, you have the Beatles' first ever hit, Love Me Do, and their first ever number 1, Please Please Me. Do You Want to Know Secret and A Taste of Honey are also personal favorites. Please Please Me is a great live-sounding debut album, and it clearly introduced the Beatles as a force to be reckoned with in the music industry.
This happened once before. I came to your door.
Number 10, Beatles for Sale. Now, it is my opinion that Beatles for Sale is the most maligned and underrated Beatles album. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that hidden in this album is one of the best ever Beatles albums and even a top 5 album. Released in December of 1964, Beatles for Sale is for me where the creative turn really begins for the Beatles. The originals on the album are the best the Beatles had written to date. Songs like No Reply, I'm a Loser, I'll Follow the Sun, I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, and Every Little Thing show real growth and maturity in their songwriting. We get the perfect Beatlemania pop song with 8 Days a Week, and the singles from the album, I Feel Fine and She's a Woman, are the strongest yet. The problem with this album are the covers. 6 covers that frankly aren't the most memorable, along with Babies in Black, which for me is one of their weakest originals. I've got a lot more to say about Beatles for Sale, but I'm going to say that for future episodes, so stay tuned. Number 9, Magical Mystery Tour. Released in December of 1967, Magical Mystery Tour was originally conceived as a double EP soundtrack to the film of the same name. Capitol Records in the US decided to create an album of the Magical Mystery Tour songs and fill side 2 with a bunch of singles from 1967. The psychedelic pop of Magical Mystery Tour is top-notch, but the album feels like a sequel to Sgt. Pepper's and even includes songs from the Sgt. Pepper sessions. This isn't really a problem, but by this time, the Beatles were known for trying something new with every album, and this album just doesn't feel new or different from the album that came before. Evidence of this are the songs Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever. These were the first two songs recorded for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and when they were released as a single ahead of the album, they were innovative and groundbreaking. But on side 2 of this album, they sound like more of the same from side 1. Standout songs on the album are I Am the Walrus, Flying, and Baby You're a Rich Man. Hello, Goodbye, and the iconic All You Need Is Love were both #1 hits. Magical Mystery Tour is a psychedelic classic, and the album cover was even featured in Stanley Kubrick's Clockwork Orange, which means, of course, the Beatles faked the moon landing.
It's been a hard day's night.
Number 8, A Hard Day's Night. Released in July of 1964, A Hard Day's Night is the soundtrack album to the movie of the same name. This was the first album with all original songs and the only Beatles album with all Lennon-McCartney compositions. The album starts with the iconic title track, A Hard Day's Night, which starts with the most iconic chord in rock history. Already on just their third album, the Beatles were innovating and pushing the boundaries of popular music. There's a bunch of real classics here. I Should Have Known Better, If I Fell, Can't Buy Me Love, And I Love Her, I'll Cry Instead, Things We Said Today, You Can't Do That, and I'll Be Back. This album is stacked. It's also worth mentioning that the film A Hard Day's Night was a massive international hit and still holds the title as the best rock and roll movie of all time. Number 7, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Perhaps the most controversial ranking on this list is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band at number 7. Released in May of 1967, Sgt. Pepper's became the soundtrack to the Summer of Love. For decades, Sgt. Pepper's, the Beatles' 7th album, was considered the best album ever recorded. It was lauded as the Beatles' masterpiece of masterpieces, and rightly so. The cover alone is considered the most iconic album cover in rock history. It was a concept album without really being a concept album. It was a pop album with sophisticated and avant-garde symphonic flourishes. If Please Please Me reintroduced rock and roll to pop music, Sgt. Pepper's introduced classical music to rock and roll. With a Little Help from My Friends, Within You Without You, Lovely Rita, and A Day in the Life are standouts on an album filled with standouts. So why is Sgt. Pepper's number 7 on my list? Because this album, as good as it is, doesn't rock. The Beatles are famous for dabbling in all sorts of genres, but for me, the Beatles are at their absolute best when they rock. And Sgt. Pepper's is too artsy to rock, and that's why it's number 7 on my list. Number 6, Abbey Road. By rights, side 2 of Abbey Road should be enough to make it number 1 on my list, but it's not. Released in September of 1969, Abbey Road is the Beatles' final album. Not their last album, but their final album. Abbey Road is their epic and brilliantly produced swan song. Let It Be, their last album, was infamously recorded before Abbey Road but released a year after. Abbey Road is arguably the Beatles' best-sounding album. It sounds more like a 70s record than it does a 60s record. It can even be argued that the Beatles invented 70s classic rock with Abbey Road. The album kicks off with one of the Beatles' best rockers. The swampy and moody come together. George Harrison announces himself as the songwriting equal to John and Paul with the classic Something and Here Comes the Sun. Side 2, of course, is where you'll find the medley. Paul McCartney and producer George Martin take the lead on what many Beatles fans consider to be the single greatest musical achievement in their illustrious career. It's almost impossible to disagree. I love all the tracks in the medley, from You Never Give Me Your Money all the way to The End. Even Her Majesty is a great little ditty. The reason this album is not higher on my list is mostly because of side 1. There are simply too many skippers for me. After Come Together, I tend to just skip to the medley on side 2. Even the songs I love on Abbey Road, I tend to skip because I've heard them one too many times. Maxwell Silverhammer, Oh Darling, Octopus's Garden, and Because. All 4 songs are someone's favorite, just not mine. Number 5, Rubber Soul. Released in December of 1965, the Beatles' 6th album is them giving the finger to Bob Dylan and the folk rock movement of the 60s. Rubber Soul is the Beatles' proclamation to the world that bubblegum Beatlemania is over, and that the Beatles were here to compete with all the pretentious folkies, both acoustically and lyrically, and do it better than all of them. Rubber Soul starts with a great rocker, Drive My Car, but then immediately gets folky and introduces the sitar to Western pop culture. Norwegian Wood, The Spirit Has Flown is one of my all-time favorite Beatles tracks. Other great tracks are Nowhere Man, Think for Yourself, Michelle, In My Life, Girl, and If I Needed Someone. What Goes On and Run for Your Life are excellent tunes, but they stick out like sore thumbs on this album. Rubber Soul is definitely an artistic progression for the Beatles, but those two songs feel more like a regression. In fact, if you were to take What Goes On and Run for Your Life off the album and stick them on Beatles for Sale, they would feel right at home. Number 4, Let It Be. Released in May of 1970, along with the documentary of the same name. This is the last album by the band. For 50 years, Let It Be has been overlooked and underrated. The album cover is one of the weakest. The movie was kind of sad and depressing. The track list was a mishmash of in-studio recordings and live rooftop tracks, intercut with goofy dialogue and sloppy jams from the sessions. I feel like lots of Beatles fans dismiss this album, but not me. I've always loved this album. Two of Us, Dig a Pony, I Me Mine, Dig It, Maggie May, the brilliant and underrated rocker I've Got a Feeling, One After 909, Let It Be, Across the Universe, For You Blue, and the classic Get Back. It was foolish of them not to include Don't Let Me Down on the album, but the Beatles did a lot of foolish things like that. I appreciate the loose, haphazard feel of Let It Be. Gives it a kind of punk aesthetic, and it's in complete contrast to the pitch-perfect Abbey Road, the album they recorded next. Shout out to Let It Be Naked and to Peter Jackson's Get Back documentary. Both of those projects convinced Beatles fans to give Let It Be a well-deserved reevaluation.
I need somebody help.
Number 3, Help. Released in August of 1965, Help was the Beatles' fifth album as well as the soundtrack to their second film, this time in color. Like A Hard Day's Night, the album Help explodes with the title track and doesn't let up. Side 1 is all movie tracks, and on Side 2, you'll find mostly filler tracks that I call killer filler. There's only one song I can't stand, and that's the closing track, Dizzy Miss Lizzy, possibly the most annoying song the Beatles ever recorded. The other cover, Act Naturally, is much, much better. I've heard Side 1 of Help described on Beatles podcasts as the perfect Beatles album side. And when you look at the track listing, it's hard to argue. Songs that deserve a shout out are Help, of course, Another Girl, Ticket to Ride, I've Just Seen a Face, and Yesterday. Number 2, The White Album. Released in November of 1968, the Beatles, aka The White Album, gave rock and roll an unexpected kick in the balls. The White Album was big and white, a double album of 30 songs in a stark white album sleeve, which was in complete contrast to the psychedelic chaos of Sgt. Pepper's and Magical Mystery Tour. The White Album was expansive, it was eclectic, it was loud, it was quiet, it screamed, it whispered, it was avant-garde and traditional, it was comforting, it was frightening, it was beautiful, and it was ugly. There are those who say it's too difficult and frustrating to listen to. George Martin and Ringo Starr both said it should have been a single disc album. The White Album became the inspiration for nearly all of the 90s grunge and metal acts. All of their musical DNA can be traced back to the White Album. There are too many songs to single out, but here's a few. Back in the USSR, Dear Prudence, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Happiness is a Warm Gun, I'm So Tired, Birthday, Mother Nature's Son, Me and My Monkey, etc., etc., etc. I'm also one of those Beatles fans who loves Revolution 9. People hate it, but I'll defend that track tooth and nail, and I'll do so in a future episode. Number 1, Revolver. Released in August of 1966, the Beatles' sixth album is now considered by many as not only the Beatles' best album, but the best album ever recorded. And they'd be right. Back in the summer of 1966, this album seemed to fly under the radar. It hit number 1 everywhere, of course, but people were too busy burning Beatle albums as a result of the Beatles Are Bigger Than Jesus controversy. Also, the Beatles didn't perform any songs off the album on their final tour. Only the single, Paperback Writer, got any promotion from the band, which is unfortunate because Revolver was the album where everything changed. The songs were trippier, the lyrics were darker, the instruments were more eclectic, the drums were bigger, the bass was louder, the guitars were heavy and far more distorted. Up until now, the Beatles were rock and roll, but from now on, the Beatles were rock. Drugs and death were the major themes of Revolver. Half the songs experimented with genre and diverse instrumentation, while the other half experimented with distorted guitars, tape loops, and backwards recording. It's almost as if there were two different bands working on this one album. Taxman set the stage with fat, funky bass, and an absolutely screaming guitar solo from Paul McCartney. The lyrics from George Harrison were a poke in the eye to the UK government of the time. Eleanor Rigby is about loneliness and death and performed by a chamber orchestra. Love You Too is George's first overture of Hindustani classical music. Yellow Submarine is an instant children's classic and is the prelude to the psychedelic musical theater of Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour. It's also one of Ringo's best vocals, and it was the inspiration for the classic animated movie Yellow Submarine. She Said is my personal favorite on the album. This John Lennon song is pure sonic boom. This is Led Zeppelin 3 years before Led Zeppelin. It's the heaviest Beatles song, only outdone by Revolution 2 years later. We also get the brilliant dual guitar solos of Andrew Bird Can Sing, McCartney's Beautiful and Sad for No One, the horns of Got to Get You Into My Life, and it's all topped off with Tomorrow Never Knows, the single greatest acid trip set to music in the history of rock and roll. So there you have it, folks, my Beatles albums ranked. Just to recap: number 13, Yellow Submarine. Number 12, With the Beatles. 11, Please Please Me. Number 10, Beatles for Sale. Number 9, Magical Mystery Tour. Number 8, A Hard Day's Night. Number 7, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Number 6, Abbey Road. Number 5, Rubber Soul. Number 4, Let It Be. Number 3, Help. Number 2, The White Album. And number 1, Revolver. I'll be referring back to this ranking in future episodes, as I have much more ranking to do. So, thanks for tuning in. Let me know in the comments below what your rankings are. In my opinion, there is no right or wrong ranking. There is no bad Beatles album, so all of them, except maybe for Yellow Submarine, are proper contenders for the best Beatles album. If you like, please like and subscribe. Can you dig it?